In all things, the people of Sincor performed the actions of life at the will of Mount Muir and Sotmosma. They spoke, they moved, they ate and drank as in life. They heard and saw and felt with the similitude of the senses that had been theirs before death, but their brains were enthralled by a dreadful necromancy. They recalled but dimly their former existence, and the state to which they had been summoned was empty, and troublous and shadow-like. Their blood ran chill and sluggish, mingled with water of Lethe, and the vapors of Lethe clouded their eyes. Dumbly they obeyed the dictates of the tyrannous lords, without rebellion or protest, but filled with a vague, illimitable weariness, such as the dead must know, when having drunk of eternal sleep, they are called back once more to the bitterness of mortal being. They knew no passion or desire or delight, only the black languor of their awakening from Lethe, and a grey ceaseless longing to return to that uninterrupted slumber. Youngest and last of the Nimboth emperors was Hilario, who had died in the first month of the plague, and had lain in his high-built mausoleum for 200 years before the coming of the Necromancers. Raised up with his people and his fathers to attend the tyrants, Hilario had resumed the emptiness of existence without question, and had felt no surprise. He had accepted his own resurrection, and that of his ancestors as one accepts the indignities and marvels of a dream. He knew that he had come back to a faded sun, to a hollow and spectral world, to an order of things in which his place was merely that of an obedient shadow. But at first, he was troubled only, like the others, by a dim weariness and pale hunger for the lost oblivion. Drugged by the magic of his overlords, weak from the age-long nullity of death, he beheld like a somnambulist the enormities to which his fathers were subjected. Yet, somehow, after many days, a feeble spark awoke in the sodden twilight of his mind, like something lost and irretrievable, beyond prodigious gulfs. He recalled the pomp of his reign in the Ethereum, and the golden pride and exaltation that had been his in youth. And recalling it, he felt a vague stirring of revolt, a ghostly resentment against the magicians who had haled him forth to this calamitous mockery of life. Darkly, he began to grieve for his fallen state, and the mournful plight of his ancestors and his people. Day by day, as a cupbearer in the halls where he had ruled aforetime, Hilario saw the doings of Miatmor and Sotmosma. He saw their caprices of cruelty and lust, their growing drunkenness and gluttony. He watched them wallow in their necromantic luxury, and became lax with indolence, gross with indulgence. They neglected the study of their art. They forgot many of their spells, but still they ruled, mighty and formidable, and, lolling on couches of purple and rose, they planned to lead an army of the dead against Tenerath. Dreaming of conquest and of vaster necromancies, they grew fat and slothful as worms that have installed themselves in a charnel rich with corruption. And pace by pace, with their laxness and tyranny, the fire of rebellion mounted in the shadowy heart of Hilario, like a flame that struggles with Lethean damps. And slowly, with the waxing of his wrath, there returned to him something of the strength and firmness that had been in his life. Seeing the turpitude of the oppressors, and knowing the wrong that had been done to the helpless dead, he heard in his brain the clamor of stifled voices demanding vengeance. Among his fathers, through the palace halls of Ethereum, Ilario moved silently at the bidding of the masters, or stood awaiting their command. He poured in their cups of onyx the amber vintages, brought by wizardry from hills beneath a younger sun. He submitted to their contumelies and insults, and night by night, he watched them nod in their drunkenness till they fell asleep, flushed and gross amid their arrogated splendor. There was little speech among the living dead, and son and father, daughter and mother, lover and beloved, went to and fro without sign of recognition, making no comment on their evil lot. But at last, one midnight, when the tyrants lay in slumber, and the flames wavered in the necromantic lamps, Ilario took counsel with Hestion, his eldest ancestor, who had been famed as a great wizard in fable, and was reputed to have known the secret lore of antiquity. Hestion stood apart from the others. In a corner of the shadowy hall, he was brown and withered in his crumbling mummy cloths, and his lightless obsidian eyes appeared to gaze still upon nothingness. He seemed not to have heard the questions of Ilario, but at length, in a dry, rustling whisper, he responded, "I am old, and the night of the sepulchre was long, and I have forgotten much, yet groping backward across the void of death, it may be that I shall retrieve something of my former wisdom, and between us we shall devise a mode of deliverance." And Hestion searched among the shreds of memory, as one who reaches into a place where the worm has been, and the hidden archives of old time have rotted in their covers, till at last he remembered and said, "I recall that I was once a mighty wizard, and among other things, I knew the spells of necromancy but employed them not, deeming their use in the raising up of the dead an abhorrent act. Also, I possessed other knowledge, and perhaps among the remnants of that ancient lore, there is something which may serve to guide us now, for I recall a dim, dubitable prophecy made in the primal years, at the founding of Ethereum and the empire of Sincor. The prophecy was that an evil greater than death would befall the emperors and the people of Sincor in future times, and that the first and last of the Nimboth dynasty, conferring together, would effect a mode of release and the lifting of the doom. The evil was not named in the prophecy, but it was said that the two emperors would learn the solution of their problem by the breaking of an ancient clay image that guards the nethermost vault below the imperial palace in the Ethereum. Then, having heard this prophecy from the faded lips of his forefather, Ilario mused a while and said, "I remember now an afternoon in early youth, when searching idly through the unused vaults of our palace, as a boy might do, I came to the last vault and found therein a dusty, uncouth image of clay, whose form and countenance were strange to me, and, knowing not the prophecy, I turned away in disappointment, and went back as idly as I had come, to seek the moted sunlight. Then, stealing away from their heedless kinfolk and carrying jeweled lamps they had taken from the hall, Hestion and Ilario went downward by subterranean stairs beneath the palace, and threading, like implacable furtive shadows, the maze of nighted corridors, they came at last to the lowest crypt. Here, in the black dust and clotted cobwebs of an immemorial past, they found, as had been decreed, the clay image, whose rude features were those of a forgotten earthly god, and Ilario shattered the image with a fragment of stone, and he and Hestion took from its hollow center a great sword of unrusted steel, and a heavy key of untarnished bronze, and tablets of bright brass on which were inscribed the various things to be done, so that Sincor should be rid of the dark reign of the Necromancers, and the people should win back to oblivious death. So with the key of untarnished bronze, Illyrio unlocked, as the tablets had instructed him to do, a low and narrow door at the end of the nethermost vault, beyond the broken image, and he and Hestian saw, as he had been prophesied, the coiling steps of somber stone that led downward to an undiscovered abyss, where the sunken fires of earth still burned. In leaving Illyrio toward the open door, Hestian took up the sword of unrusted steel in his thin hand, and went back to the hall where the necromancers slept, lying asprawl on their couches of rose and purple, with the wan, bloodless dead about them in patient ranks. Upheld by the ancient prophecy and the lore of the bright tablets, Hestian lifted the great sword and struck off the head of Matmur and the head of Sadosma, each with a single blow. Then, as had been directed, he quartered the remains with mighty strokes, and the necromancers gave up their unclean lives and lay supine, without movement, adding a deeper red to the rose and a brighter hue to the sad purple of their couches. Then, to his kin, who stood silent and listless, hardly knowing their liberation, the venerable mummy of Hestian spoke in serious murmurs, but authoritatively, as a king who issues commands to his children. The dead emperors and empresses stirred, like autumn leaves in a sudden wind, and a whisper passed among them and went forth from the palace to be communicated at length, by devious ways, to all the dead of Sincor. All that night, and during the blood-dark day that followed, by wavering torches of the light of the failing sun, an endless army of plague-eaten leeches, of tattered skeletons, poured in a ghastly torrent through the streets of Ethereum, and along the palace hall where Hestian stood guard above the slain necromancers. Unpausing with vague, fixed eyes, they went on like driven shadows, to seek the subterranean vaults below the palace, to pass through the open door where Illyrio waited in the last vault, and then to wend downward by 1,000 steps to the verge of that gulf in which boiled the ebbing fires of earth. There, from the verge, they flung themselves to a second death, and the clean annihilation of the bottomless flames. But, after all had gone to their release, Hestian still remained, alone in the fading sunset, besides the cloven corpses of Matmur and Sadosma. There, as the tablets had directed him to do, he made trial of those spells of elder necromancy which he had known in his former wisdom, and cursed the dismembered bodies with that perpetual life and death which Matmur and Sadosma had sought to inflict upon the people of Sincor. And maledictions came from the pale lips, and the heads rolled horribly with glaring eyes, and the limbs and torsos writhed on their imperial couches amid clotted blood. Then, with no backward look, knowing that all was done, as had been ordained and predicted from the first, the mummy of Hestian left the necromancers to their doom, and went wearily through the nighted labyrinth of vaults to rejoin Illyrio. So, in tranquil silence, with no further need of words, Illyrio and Hestian passed through the open door of the nether vault, and Illyrio locked the door behind them with its key of untarnished bronze. And thence, by the coiling stairs, they wended their way to the verge of the sunken flames, and were one with their kinfolk and their people in the last ultimate nothingness. But of Matmur and Sadosma, men say that their quartered bodies crawl to and fro to this day in the Ethereum, finding no peace or respite from their doom of life and death. and seeking vainly through the black maze of nether vaults the door that was locked by Illyrio.